Good afternoon. This is Dave Anderson, a senior policy fellow at the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, otherwise known as WIPS.
Hi, Dave. I'm Eric Giordano. I'm the executive director of WIPS, and we'd like to welcome all our viewers to this week's show, How a Conservative Supreme Court Saved Congressional Oversight. That's a real cliffhanger title, so I can't wait to hear from our distinguished guest today to find out what that's all about. On that note, Dave, I'm sure everyone is all abuzz to learn about WIPS.
Of course, Eric. Founded in 2007, WIPS is a unit of the University of Wisconsin system with a mission to educate and engage citizens, develop future leaders, and help communities address issues that they care about.
Yeah, speaking of buzz, Dave, what did you do with your hair? It looks terrific. And I'm sure our viewers also want to know how they can share their hair puns as well as show ideas. So how can they do that, Dave?
Well, clearly, Eric, we need some new hair puns to put into the mix here based on your attempt just a few minutes ago. But they can email us at info@wips.org. And during the live show, they can make comments or pose questions to our guests via the Facebook chat section. Eric, a couple of weeks ago, our crack producer, also our token representative of an attractive and younger demographic, Luke Rudolph, came up with a cutting-edge story about Nathan's virtual hot dog eating contest. Luke, I understand you've got an important update for us.
I sure do. Mr. Joey Chestnut celebrated his 13th win at Nathan's hot dog eating contest. He also set the new world record for 75 hot dogs in only 10 minutes. So good job, Joey, and I think that's something I might start training for.
Well, sorry to deviate from our usual hair puns, but I'm reminded of something funny from my childhood. So Luke, what do you call a frozen Frankfurter?
I don't know. What do you call a frozen Frankfurter?
You call it a chili dog. A chili dog.
Oh my gosh. Okay, that's pretty desperate. Anyway, as important as that update was, Dave, I'm really excited this week because we're introducing a new segment to our show, ripped straight from the headlines again, that we're calling Bipartisan Heroes. And once again, our crack producer, which we could also comment on, is Luke Rudolph.
This comes to us from Pennsylvania. A state senator's lost wallet was found and returned by an unexpected bystander, her opponent in the upcoming election. Devlin Robinson, a Republican running for the 37th District State Senate seat currently held by Democrat Pam Iovino, spotted his wallet in the middle of the road and decided to investigate. Robinson said he was shocked to open the wallet and discovered it belonged to his political rival. Devlin returned the wallet and said she was thrilled to have it back, and I was delighted to help out a fellow veteran. Sometimes it's great to put the politics aside.
You know, that is a great example of bipartisanship. And of course, at WIPS, we're all about bipartisanship. So that's really a very applicable story. It does kind of remind me, though, of the guy who had his wallet stolen. And when he was chasing the mugger, was thinking to himself, wow, this guy's giving me a good run for my money. Oops, sorry.
Oh my gosh.
I had to do
terrible.
it. I had to do it.
It's just getting worse. This is why we need viewer help.
Well, with no further ado, it's really time to introduce our very special guest today. From 1985 to 2014, Elise Bean worked as an investigator for Senator Carl Levin, a Democratic senator from Michigan, including 15 years at the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, known for its bipartisan, fact-based investigations into incredibly complex issues. Appointed his subcommittee staff director and chief counsel in 2003, Elise handled investigations, hearings, and legislation on matters involving money laundering, offshore tax abuse, corruption, shell companies, and corporate misconduct. After Senator Levin retired in 2015, Elise helped establish the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School, a nonprofit whose primary mission is to strengthen bipartisan oversight capacity in Congress and state legislatures. She now serves as the co-director of the Levin Center's Washington, D.C. office. Over the past 4 years, she has helped train over 200 House and Senate staffers from both parties on investigative techniques. She's also authored a variety of materials related to oversight, including a 2018 book on investigations called Financial Exposure, Carl Levin's Senate Investigations into finance and tax abuse. Eric, please join me in welcoming Elise to today's show.
Yeah, welcome, Elise. We're really happy to have you.
Thanks so much. I have to tell you, I was laughing at those jokes.
Good. You're the only one. All right. Well, let's get right to the questions. So, the Supreme Court recently issued 2 rulings related to the president's tax returns, and by the way, that's the basis for our title for the show today. Tell us what these rulings mean and what it means in terms of executive privilege, as well as congressional oversight. And also, please help us explain why that a dramatic title.
Well, the 2 cases, the first one's called Trump versus Vance, and it had to do with a prosecutor from Manhattan, New York, who subpoenaed his accounting firm for some financial records. The second one was called Trump versus Mazars, and it involved 3 congressional committees that had issued subpoenas either for his accounting firm or for some banks. Now, when these cases, when the subpoenas went out, President Trump sued in the courts to block them. And there were a lot of predictions that he was going to win the cases. He was making arguments that presidents were completely immune from subpoenas by prosecutors or by Congress. He also said courts didn't even have jurisdiction to rule on those cases. And there was also thinking that he was asking for, if he didn't have immunity and if there was jurisdiction, he wanted an extremely high standard that would make it really hard for either a prosecutor or Congress to investigate or to get documents related to the president. Well, those are very dark predictions. I was very worried about them, but none of those predictions came to pass. Instead, Congress pretty much won both cases. Well, the prosecutor definitely won. The court said there is no immunity from prosecutor subpoenas for records, a grand jury subpoena, and there's no heightened standard. He said that in part because the documents in question were not government documents. They were financial records. So there was no executive privilege, for example. These were just his financial forms, his tax returns, other kinds of documents that his accountants and his banks had. So the prosecutor, no immunity, no heightened standard. For Congress, the Supreme Court said no immunity again. Presidents are not just absolutely immune from subpoenas from Congress. And they said there was jurisdiction to resolve a dispute between the 2 branches. However, there was a slightly heightened standard, but it wasn't one of the extreme standards that the president was calling for. It was really pretty reasonable. They said you had to have a specific explanation for why you needed the information. You had to show that you couldn't get the information anywhere else. And you had to think about the balance of powers, both Congress's right to information and the president's right to keep some information confidential. But again, since these are not government records, they're private records, there's no heightened standard, no executive privilege involved. So I think when we're all said and done, Congress dodged a bullet. Was our entire system of checks and balances was upheld. And the cases have now gone back to the district court. There's still some issues to be sort of figured out. Some people have said Congress lost because it's clear they're not going to get the president's tax returns before the election. But to me, first of all, if you need tax returns at this point to decide how to vote, I don't know what to say to you. But even aside from that, Congress and its oversight investigative powers are not about elections. They're really not. And if you don't get some information in time for an election, for me, that's beside the point. Instead, the kinds of issues here, Congress is thinking about, should we require presidents to make their tax return public? There's an issue about if the IRS audits, the IRS is required to audit the president's returns every single year, but no one knows how that process works. And there have been some rumors that pressure was put on the IRS and how it was handling President Trump's tax returns. So we want to know about that process, not just for him, but for all presidents. And there's other issues, the emoluments clause, which prohibits the president from accepting things of value from foreign governments. Was that violated? Do we need some rules? We've never sort of implemented that constitutional clause, et cetera. So I'm not worried that we're not going to get documents in time for the election. To me, that's not the point. But what is the point is that Congress have the right to serve as a check and a balance for the executive branch.
Elise, just a follow-up question. I've kind of been a lifelong student of government, and I've been fascinated with the way the process works, exactly like the founding fathers designed it, to resolve these conflicts between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Where would you say this decision stacks up in the long list of issues that have gone to the Supreme Court in our history relative to the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch? Is this a huge issue or not so huge issue?
It would have been huge if it had gone badly for Congress, but because it sort of kind of reaffirmed the status quo. So I think that's important. The Supreme Court hasn't spoken about Congress's right to investigate in decades, and they reaffirmed the right of Congress to get information in order to legislate or act as a check and balance and all the other tasks they have. So I'd say it's very important for Congress, and had it gone the other way, it would have been a really big problem. Same thing for prosecutors. These issues had never come in front of the court in 200 years. Could a prosecutor, subpoena documents related to the president? Could Congress subpoena documents related to the president? These personal financial papers never came before the court before. And that's because the branches always worked it out. But this president said, no, I'm totally immune. I'm not dealing with you. I'm not giving you a thing. And it was that extreme position that led to the court having to speak on something it never had for 200 years.
You've had an incredibly interesting background, and including the 15 years you've been at the Permanent Senate Subcommittee on Investigations. I'm really interested to just learn a little bit more about the role of the subcommittee, where it's situated, what it does, and specifically, what kind of work did you do when you were with the subcommittee?
Well, sure. The subcommittee, it's called the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. It's got this weird name. And the reason behind it is it was first set up when Harry Truman was back in the Senate before he became president. And he was asked during World War II to do a big investigation trying to stop war profiteering, waste, fraud, and abuse in the World War II and all the defense industry. So he did such a terrific job. He did it on a bipartisan basis. They came up with all these common sense solutions to fix a bunch of problems. And he did such a good job that they decided to make his subcommittee permanent. Back then, Congress created subcommittees for specific investigations and then they disappeared. They decided they needed a permanent subcommittee with people who were skilled in investigations. So ever since then, PSI, as we call it, has been doing a whole bunch of complex investigations. They often last a year, and they do them on a bipartisan basis, in part because one of the early on chairs of PSI was Joe McCarthy. Thank you, Wisconsin. And he did such a terrible job while leading that subcommittee, was so abusive in the way he investigated things, that the subcommittee changed its rules to become much more bipartisan and to be much more careful about how it did its investigations. So we've done all kinds of things. Give you some examples. We looked at the financial crisis. We looked at Enron when it collapsed. We've looked at offshore tax abuse, a whole range of different kinds of issues.
Thanks, Elise. The next question, I have a quick question and then a follow-up. How many members of the Senate, maybe the Congress who are in the Senate, are actually on that committee at a time, usually, a number of senators?
So it's a pretty small group. It's under 10. And in fact, the subcommittee itself, despite its big reputation, is quite small. So you'd ask me, what did I do on the subcommittee? I started off as an investigator. Then I became the deputy chief of staff, and then I became the staff director and chief counsel for the subcommittee. So I was with them for 15 years, and we actually investigated. And we had Democrats, Republicans. We always did all of our investigations on a bipartisan basis. And I'll just say, I found that when you investigate with people who agree with you, it's like in an echo chamber. You don't challenge each other. All kinds of facts get dropped, issues get dropped. But when you investigate with people whose worldviews are really fundamentally different than your own, you start to look at the facts more carefully and you challenge each other. And by the time you're done, your facts are usually more accurate. They're more thorough. I'd say they're more thoughtful, and I'd say they're definitely more credible if the two sides can agree on them.
So speaking of that, who, what, and why does the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations decide to investigate? Like what was that process look like? Like walk us through that.
Well, that's one of the hardest things of all, because we only have a little bit of time to investigate each year. You can't do a whole bunch. So we did maybe 3 or 4 investigations during a year. So we'd have to go through a whole process of deciding, well, which ones. The chair and the ranking member from the opposite party would decide on what they would investigate. In PSI, because of Mr. McCarthy, our minority has the right to initiate investigations, which is unusual in Congress, but we want it to be even more bipartisan than usual. So what we would do is every 6 months, we would get together with Senator Levin and we'd say, well, here are 4 or 5 ideas. And we might take them from a scandal in the newspaper, or when there was a financial crisis, Levin said, we're dropping everything else. We're going to do that for the next year. When Enron collapsed, he decided again, stop everything, we're going to do that. But sometimes he had his own ideas. For example, he was very concerned about offshore tax abuse. So he had us look at UBS, which was one of the largest banks in the world and known for helping wealthy individuals open offshore accounts in Switzerland and elsewhere. And he had us do a whole investigation on that, and we exposed what UBS was doing. And it led to a lot of changes, both in US law and internationally. So sometimes what they care about, sometimes what's happening, what's hot.
You know, we talked a little bit about the importance of bipartisanship when we told the wallet story earlier, and you've alluded to bipartisanship quite a bit already this morning. Can you provide us with some other really good examples of an effective bipartisan investigation that was undertaken by the subcommittee?
Sure. So all of our investigations were bipartisan, but I'll just what does that mean to be bipartisan?
Right,
when you
exactly.
Investigate? So once you decide on the topic, the first thing we do is we talk about how to frame it, and we do this with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. We then draw up a joint set of document requests that we both agree on. So each side gets to get the documents they're interested in, and sometimes you have different ideas about what's relevant. Then you do your interviews together. So what we did, we actually shared questions ahead of time. So everybody would get their questions in and they would know in what order, because sometimes that was important. We do joint reports. So we get input from both sides until both sides could join in that report. We couldn't always get it, but we would try to get as much agreement as possible. And we did joint press releases. And that meant you had to frame the issue the same way and have quotes. Each side would know what the other side was doing. Now, not all congressional investigations are like that. Sometimes they're very partisan. The two sides go to their own corners. They don't coordinate at all. And the result is a hearing that's much more disjointed and often difficult to follow. And it may even be incoherent because the two sides are yelling at each other and they have such different ideas about what the topic is that it's hard to follow. In contrast, PSI, because we coordinated so carefully, our hearings were very coordinated, very coherent, very joint, and therefore a lot more powerful. Give you two quick examples. Levin investigated the financial crisis. He went after Goldman Sachs. We had our ranking at the time was Tom Coburn, a very conservative member from Oklahoma. And he had his own ideas about what caused the financial crisis. And we subpoenaed a lot of information and we all looked at it together and we were able to identify problems in the system. And we were able to do that in a joint way. Similarly, he was concerned about Social Security disability fraud, people who were fraudulently getting these benefits so the people really needed them, the money was gone. So I was a big skeptic when he introduced that topic, but we did all of our investigation together, and to my surprise, there was massive fraud going on, and they found a law firm and a lawyer aptly named Eric Kahn, who was conning the system and had made millions of dollars getting people who were not disabled, getting them disability benefits. So it worked both ways, and those are just two examples.
Wow.
Thanks for sharing that. You know, you alluded to this. It seems like today we hear nothing but stories about the bitter political divide in both the House and the Senate. And it seems like your experience was somewhat different to that. Now, you retired in 2015, is that right?
Right.
So has something fundamentally changed between, you know, 2015 and today? How do you explain the divide that we seem to see all the time when we hear the term investigation?
Well, I'd say in the investigative world, in the oversight world, there's sort of two different worlds that don't always touch on each other. So the hearings that the press likes to put on TV always seem to be the most partisan ones, the ones where you have a partisan topic, people don't agree, they think that's dramatic, but of course it depicts Congress as in this bitter war with each other. Even today, there are many, many bipartisan investigations that go on. And when I talk to my reporter friends and say, hey, are you going to cover this hearing? They're like, it's bipartisan, it's boring. No, we're not going to put it on, you know, no TV and no coverage. And so PSI, where I worked today, is doing a lot of really amazing bipartisan stuff, looking at cybersecurity issues, looking at opioid shipments through the post office, things involving China. They've done a whole series of investigations. No one hears about those. They're never televised, rarely covered in the press, and yet they're bipartisan, useful, addressing important problems. So I think there's a yin and a yang that goes on, and it's unfortunate that the media says the only thing that's interesting to the public are the hearings where everybody disagrees. I think that's too bad.
Are there any specific investigations, Elise, that viewers and the public generally should just be paying attention to and should be keeping an eye on as we look to the future?
Well, the big one is COVID. You know, COVID is involving trillions of dollars. And you may have seen in the press, there are a lot of questions being raised about who's getting that money. There have been questions about the PPP loans going to people, private equity or wealthy individuals. There's money going to hospitals, but it turns out that the wealthy hospitals with big endowments are getting more money than the smaller hospitals without endowments. So there's a whole series of issues, counterfeit masks, inaccurate testing. So there are a lot of different kinds of investigations going on, unemployment benefits, about how that system's working or not working. So I would say COVID is sort of the big thing right now, and seeing how that money is being spent and trying to protect taxpayers from being ripped off.
Well, we're kind of drawing to the conclusion here, Elise, but I have one more important question, and I wanted to highlight your book. I was going to hold it up, but I don't think with my background screen it's going to show, but I'll remind the viewers of the title. It's a critically acclaimed book called Financial Exposure: Carl Levin's Senate Investigations into Finance and Tax Abuse. And in that book, there's a quote where you say, constructive congressional oversight lies at the core of our democratic system of checks and balances. I'm assuming that's a part of the thesis of your book, but what are you trying to tell readers about the importance of this oversight?
Well, thank you so much for asking that question. People don't really think very much about oversight, but the way Senator Levin used to put it, if you want good government, you need good oversight. Government on its own is always has problems. There are always ways it can be improved. And the only way you can identify the problems and get them corrected is if you have somebody doing oversight, who's doing investigations, who's looking at what the government is doing. And it's not just the government, it's the private sector too. When we see banks ripping off consumers, or we see the BP oil companies with spills, you know, how did that happen? Should the government be doing something about it? And the issue of looking at what, you know, Congress looking at the executive branch, that's also in the Constitution of checks and balances, that you don't want any one branch of government to become too powerful. So, you know, I've sort of spent my life on it. I really believe it, that good government requires good oversight. So that's what I hope you take away from that book. And we give you a lot of examples showing how oversight did lead to improvements and reforms.
That's terrific. We really thank you, Elise Bean. We appreciate your public service, your deep knowledge and experience, and also the important work that you're continuing to do at the Levin Center, which, to remind our viewers, is a nonprofit entity that's attached to Wayne State University Law School. And also, you're still training congressional staffers, right?
So I'll just give you an example. We take staffers from Democratic Party, the Republican, from the House and the Senate. We put them on bipartisan, bicameral teams, which they've never done before. And then we give them fake scandals and we work them through the investigator process to try to improve their skills. So we're still doing that. We're doing it on a bipartisan basis. There's a lot of goodwill to investigate together. And we hope to continue that effort as the years go by.
Great. You can find out more information about some of the oversight cases that Elise mentioned at oversightcases.org. I just went on the site and there's some interesting cases there. So it's a great resource.
We're tracking court developments in oversight. So that's what that website, and there's the Levin Center website, which has all kinds of information, including little online tutorials if you want to learn how to investigate yourself.
Oh, so nice. I can use that as I investigate where my wallet went. I think Dave.
No, there's some hair-raising issues out there. Oh, hair-raising. Oh, sorry about that.
Wow. Okay. I guess we give you brownie points for that. Well, but we are out of time. And once again, we sincerely apologize to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson for running out of time. We certainly hope he'll join us next week. Dave, what do we got on tap for next week, by the way?
Well, yeah, speaking of next week, of course, we'll be back on Friday, July 24th for another exciting episode of Two Bald Guys. We're going to be discussing the tension between freedom versus safety in the COVID environment, and we're going to have some really outstanding guests. Hey, Eric, I want to give you something to think about for next week, and I'll be looking for an answer when we get back on the air here. So when you wash your face, exactly how far up do you go? So think about that and get back to me next week.
You know, Dave, I just want to say it feels like you're on the razor's edge of impropriety, but I still like you. So I'll look forward to seeing you next week. And thank you, Luke Rudolph. Bye, everybody.
Bye.